Yeah, climate change. We're still here.
We're still here.
Doing it.
We're talking about climate change for this one.
Yeah, this place is so beautiful.
Yeah.
I thought it would be a really fantastic moment to talk about how we're destroying the planet that we live in.
I know, and how to hold on to what we have left, right?
Well, so one of the things we're trying to do in this conversation is be a little more positive about things.
Yes, exactly.
Realistic, but positive.
Yeah.
And I think, what did I write on the list here? Yeah, so I think one of the things that you've really been working on hard, one of the things that I've really been working on hard, but in a different way, is just communicating to people.
Yeah.
Doing this.
Yeah.
To you, to everybody, just doing our best. Yeah. And one of the most important things that we communicate on a regular basis is climate change.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that you've been passionate and concerned about basically your entire life. Your parents
from the womb, basically.
Your parents set you up for that one.
Yeah, they really did. And it's interesting. And looking at the different ways and kind of memes that are out there around climate change, and as someone who is not a climate scientist, but I study ecological restoration and some of the subfields related to it, I have a bit more education than somebody who's not studying that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you're extremely knowledgeable
about some of that stuff.
You're not technically a scientist.
No, but the point is that, you see these kind of myths occur, and not only in terms of climate change discourse and how it's talked about in media and by people, even people with, I would say, who should know better, but the myths are not just, incorrect. They can be really harmful, in my opinion, for people who are consuming that media all the time. Mm-hmm. And one of the big myths about is kind of this idea of fighting climate change or stopping climate change.
Yes.
Like, you'll still hear that a lot, especially when politicians speak.
The Great Reversal.
The Great Reversal. And that's just not realistic. And what more I try to talk to people about is about kind of lessening, modulating behavior, reducing impacts, adjusting,
adapting.
Tuning, right?
Exactly.
Like almost like you're tuning your guitar or your volume control, right? You're not stopping the instrument from playing or the music from playing. You're trying to tune it down, right?
Exactly.
I think that's a key feature, is that, we're already experiencing climate change right now, and we're going to continue experiencing it for the foreseeable future. But where we can intervene is how, in terms of, if you look at, like, imagine it being kind of like a wave form, how do we kind of bring that wave so that the oscillations aren't quite as dramatic or insane, and the weather isn't quite as predictable, unpredictable, that we can keep things kind of contained in a more manageable set of parameters, and that's not as sexy as saying let's get around and let's fight it. It's like, let's declare war on it as war on climate change.
Learn to live with it.
So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and then
so what are if we're talking about sort of trying to reduce valleys and reduce troughs? What are the sort of things that you think are actually important that we can do?
So one of the things that was really interesting, and it came out with from an organization called the Carbon Brief, either this year or late 2023. And it was looking at how carbon emissions have kind of flatlined over the last 10 years. And it said, a large part of this was the pandemic, obviously. There was a big dip, and then it's dropped back up. But what they were also saying is around 10% of the change is due to land use changes. And these include land preservation and, ecological restoration, reforestation. And, I've been kind of ringing that bell for years of that kind of, if we actually restore land, rebuild soil, we can have a dramatic impact in a very short amount of time, because soil is essentially living, right?
It's funny because you reminded me, we even talked about it when I watched it, I think. But you guys have probably all heard of the Dyson sphere.
Yes.
And Mr. Dyson, if you haven't looked at him, is a total loon in all the best kind of ways, really. He's crazy, he's all over the place. And one of the things that he ended up in was, weirdly enough, sort of climate denial adjacent. And not like, I'm out there taking money from the oil companies trying to deny climate. But he genuinely did his own numbers and crunched things, and he was like, if we make this amount of change to our topsoil distribution of CO2, this whole problem goes away, essentially. So for him, it just seemed like a totally manageable issue.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I believe his analysis.
Yes.
He says a lot of crazy things, and he has fantastic, awesome ideas, but I really appreciate that approach.
Definitely. And I actually first heard it, to your point, it's really funny, I first heard about this statistic from the Carbon Brief from a guy who was doing soft climate denialism, which is really interesting. Except he cherry picked and said we're actually, emissions are decreasing, and that's not actually the case. They're flatlining, right? So that guy's name is, if I just remember, oh man, this is this is hurting me. I can come back to that. But essentially is that, how kind of, it's important that you talk about climate denial and climate denial adjacent people, because that's something I've been thinking a lot about as well as I communicate climate. I'm finding, especially around people my age and younger, who tend to be more in kind of a hippie community. And I'm not talking too much about teenagers here. These are more people in their late 20s, early 30s.
Actually,
yeah,
sort of
more, more adults, and they, they're not old, but they're not young per se. I find actually a significant percentage of people I talk to in that range are skeptical about climate change.
Wow.
And skeptical about the words
even though
of climate change.
They're ecologically concerned.
Even though they're ecologically concerned, and these can be people, just last week in Ottawa, the same guy who's been doing land maintenance and land care on this property that I had to go see for my job is the same guy who's denying climate change because he heard about it on a podcast, right?
Yeah.
So
cool.
What's key is you can have people who are very environmentally aware and conscious, but have just really bad, in my opinion, bad politics when it comes to climate change or bad information. Fascinating. So it's really fascinating. So with that, the reason why I wanted to talk on the podcast about it is it made me think about different ways to communicate climate change without using that word, right? So I start...
Sorry to put a tiny pin in that.
Of course.
Hold on to your thought because we'll be right back to it. Mm-hmm. But that thing has been hugely important to me lately. This idea of particular words being really loaded with negativity, with poison, with just damaging conversations and dialogues in ways that they really shouldn't.
Right.
So sorry.
No, absolutely, and that's key. Is like and often I can find as soon as if I use the word climate change, some part of somebody's brain is shutting down very quickly, right?
Yes. Yep.
Unfortunately. And so, ways I've gotten around that is starting with something that impacts them. Like the EPA last year came out with new classification for the forever plastics or the forever chemicals, for example, right? So these are the plastics and chemicals that last in our bodies and in our ecosystems for not quite forever, but much longer than a human lifespan, right? So these include like the microplastics, the meme about there being, however much weight of microplastics in every human body, right? Talking to people about that and saying, that's actually part of a larger crisis, and you're right, we shouldn't just think about climate change, we have to think about these other things too. It's harder, I find, for people to kind of dismiss climate change. It's harder for people to dismiss microplastics than climate change, because climate change can be thought of as external, as happening across the other side of the world.
Well, they have their own idea for how it works. Maybe there's some weather wizard or something can manipulate something.
The cloud seeding.
If you talk about tiny plastics, everybody's like, I know what plastic is.
I know what plastic. Oh, that's not great.
That's
in me right now, right?
It's silly, but it's simple and it works.
Exactly. And so, this is why other scientists are approaching climate change and climate change communication differently these days. One is the Rockström Institute in Sweden, and they look at the climate crisis as just one facet of the ecology crisis, essentially. Wow. So they have 9 different planetary boundaries that the human species is either surpassed or pushing up against. One of those is climate change. Others include nitrogen and geochemical cycles, right?
So, but they're thinking of it very specifically, like CO2.
CO2, exactly. CO2, methane. But they're also looking at ocean acidification. They're looking at farmland and land use
just for their
problems.
Climate change evaluation?
No, for the other planetary boundaries.
So they're separating it out. Got it.
Separating it out. They talk about it in that, obviously all of these things are interconnected, but it's helpful to communicate this to people, that there's a kind of, they draw it like a wheel of different planetary boundaries and systems that are being negatively impacted, that are all kind of feeding back and enhancing each other. So it's not just one thing, it's all of these difficult systems interacting with each other that are causing the world to work, to, and our ecologies to collapse in the way that they are. Yeah. But I find when I talk to people about that, there's more of a sense of interest, because they haven't necessarily heard someone talk about that.
Yeah.
And also it doesn't necessarily force them to relinquish their beliefs on climate change. It invites them to think about...
It opens up a path.
It opens up a path to thinking about the
take a path
ideas
around a
differently.
very tense subject.
Exactly. You don't need to think about that right now. Think about this stuff,
Exactly.
Work through with this stuff if that's easier. So that's one approach I've had, yeah.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a guy I know too much about, Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Oh, yes.
I'm not wearing his watch today, but I got a weird relationship with Arnie, but I got a weird relationship with Arnie. But so he, I remember, came out quite actively with what I thought was a very clever position at the time, and it was years ago. It was like 2012 or something. But it was basically, it was when Facebook was cool and I was on it.
Yeah.
And so was he. And he put out this post, and he was like, maybe the climate's changing, maybe it's not. But pollution is going through the roof, and we have rock solid evidence that increased air pollution murders people.
Yeah.
So why bother thinking about the cosmic, consequences of the earth going up in a ball of flames,
right.
When you could just be thinking about actual people dying right now
Yes.
from air pollution,
Yes.
and that we can stop that. That is unnecessary.
Yes.
And that's... I understand on one way, like part of the issue, we've talked about social media on this pod, part of the issue is that diverse set of narratives does not communicate well on social media. Social media is so much more about trends and hitting things exactly when they should be, and you got to get it right, and the speed and the reactivity is the most important thing right now.
Definitely.
And that will change. It will have to change.
Yeah.
Because for the simple reason that we just all don't care that much about the same thing.
Yeah.
Like for me, the last big Twitter moment was the slap.
Yeah.
And now Twitter's done. I don't think it'll have a moment like that again. But I remember going on Twitter when Will Smith slapped Chris Rock. and people were losing their minds, and it was but that was the only place to get that sort of like second by second blow of that information.
Yeah.
But that's the last time I've been involved in a sort of social media moment like that.
Yeah.
Especially when it felt so universal.
I think the momentary nature of social media is really important, and it has to do with like a lot of the rhetoric, like the fighting climate change. Those are all like hashtags, right?
So how do we? Sorry to cut you off, but how do we leverage that in the fight against social media, in the fight against climate change?
Well, I
leverage social media in the fight against climate change.
I think that's a great question. I think as well, what's done really well on social media are kind of these almost like really small paragraph essays on history, and they've kind of become sort of memes in a sense.
Okay.
That people will provide 2 to 3 images and provide a little historical context. I especially see people advocating for Black Lives Matter or Indigenous sovereignty. They'll do this kind of thing, and they're actually able to pack quite a bit of good information into these memes without, in my opinion, taking away from or cutting corners or misconstruing the kind of core message. Because one of the memes I think that's really important to get out there through social media is something you brought up, is that humans have always had an impact on our environment. This ain't nothing new, right? This ain't nothing new. So I wanted to know, you had a great story. I was wondering if you'd share that about kind of just even seed dispersal.
Oh gosh, yeah, you're right. So this is very simple, and basically, this all comes back to me reading a book by a guy called Oliver Rackham, I believe, on the forestry of the UK.
Yeah.
And the book is incredibly dense and technical.
Right.
For a forestry book, holy smokes. But I love it for a number of reasons, and one of the basic sort of core message of the book is very simple. Yeah. It's that there's this story of the UK going through this period of like absurd shipbuilding where it cut down all its forests, and then away they went, and that's why the UK's forestry industry is the way it is today.
Right.
That is a lie, according to Mr. Rackham, and his evidence seems pretty good. He basically looked at the amount of woodland before and after the development of British shipbuilding and said, gosh, there's relatively little change here.
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense in the context of his whole book, because his whole book is about how basically ancient humans in the UK have been carrying out forest maintenance and restoration with very specific financial goals.
Yeah.
You know, they not only are they keeping these forests in this remarkable shape, but they're also doing it in order to harvest different simple economic sections of it. So it's all based around oaks, which are these huge, incredibly big money, really solid wooden trees, right? Grow slowly, get really big. Yeah. But then all the smaller kindling and things around them, they grow specifically smaller trees that are happy to grow in that, and then they harvest them regularly for kindling. Yeah. And there's even an intermediate level of tree that they've figured out to grow in between it, which they keep small using coppicing, which is a technique whereby you cut off the top branches of the tree at a particular stage of its life and it just keeps regrowing them, and you just keep cutting them off. Yeah. They built this entire economical structure around taking wood out of nature and bringing it to reality, and that had just been going on.
Absolutely.
So, that for me was pretty nuts.
It's pretty profound, man, and it really, I love that story because it strikes to the heart of another big myth, right? Is that humans and nature are separate from each other and need to be kept separate so that nature can survive for its own will. And as Oliver Rackham is pointing out in this particular instance, he's part of a critique that's emerged from within that field of environmental studies that's reacting against it. And my discipline of ecological restoration is all about how humans can intervene and do intervene in ecosystems for the betterment of them, right? So, but that kind of, it's interesting that sort of approach to the environment that's, I would say, more conservative and in the actual traditional sense of the word conservation, right? That's now having to kind of make room for a much more robust modern approach, because unfortunately, when you look at the history of environmentalism, especially in this part of the world, you can look at the establishment of the national parks in both the US and Canada. First one, Yellowstone, in the United States in the 1870s, for example. They're all it all sounds great until you have to uproot a bunch of indigenous people living on those lands and put them somewhere else, sometimes at the expense of their lives, right? And that's a kind of weight that has been hanging around, or an albatross around the neck of environmental conservation for over 100 years now. We're really trying to work on that. And that's why, the city of Toronto, for example, does controlled burns in High Park and works with indigenous organizations to do that, because that's what indigenous people were doing in that region to control the forests,
it's attempted maintaining indigenous practices that work that shaped the modern ecology of this.
And we just kind of read we were talking about Hobbes. So, there's a great book that's called Reclaiming the Don, and it's about the Don River in Toronto. And the first part of that book, the author talks about John Graves Simcoe, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada and the founder of Toronto. So, John Graves Simcoe, she makes the argument, he sees this plot of land where Toronto is going to be built. Instantly he thinks natural defensible harbor from the Americans. He sees a whole plan together, but he also sees kind of this terra nullis, this empty landscape, this landscape that, is the sort of state of nature that Hobbes and others are thinking about, and Rousseau are thinking about when they're trying to think about why human societies come together.
Right.
But the problem with that, and also he's informed by what another academic calls the magisterial gaze, and this is the gaze of landscape painters coming over here and painting these vast. They say, think of the group of 7 who come a little later, but these vast Canadian or American wildernesses, right? Completely devoid of people, right? Yeah. And you go there
under these huge scales.
Huge scales, right? So you can imagine that's all part of the mythos that John Graves Simcoe is thinking about when he comes to Canada. And unfortunately, as you can see in the Develop in the City, as he first lays out a plan and then that's picked up by developers, essentially they removed Indigenous people and removed the not only Indigenous people but the traditional lifeways and hunting areas that they were doing along the Don in order to kind of sort of reify this particular imaginative understanding of nature that wasn't real, right?
Well, one of the things I find fascinating and I don't know enough about, and you undoubtedly know more than me, is the different provincial park systems, the state parks, government parks, whatever they are.
Yes.
And one of the things that's so striking for me, having just come back from the UK, is that their provincial park system is just different.
Yes.
And it's not provincial, obviously, it's whatever they call it, I can't remember. But their park system is just different, national parks.
Interesting, yeah.
And the easiest way to explain it is you just sort of move into national parks. Different national park regions have different protected status. Mm-hmm. There's certain things you can or cannot do within them. Mm-hmm. But you have free movement within them.
Right.
Whereas over here in North America, you go into a provincial park or you go towards a provincial park, you almost inevitably are hit with some sort of toll or some sort of parking thing or payment thing. Yeah, we read it a couple days ago. So it's
exactly. It's fresh.
But for me, when I'm looking at a map on the UK and I see provincial park labeled, I think that's a good place to go to get some free walking.
Right.
To see some beautiful landscape and not have to pay any money. Whereas here, it's just not true. And what I do instead, useful tip for you guys driving around this place, I look for beaches. Beaches are free. Provincial parks are not, and they often have free parking.
No, exactly. And it's really interesting, like, one of the hot issues that we don't have to get into too much is how you do conservation financing. That's a big one.
How do you do conservation financing?
Right now, it's kind of I'm going to go through the ecological restoration lens because that's the one I know the best. Right now, the industry that I'm working on trying to carve my own path out of right now, there's 2 things you can either do. You can either there's 3 things. You can either go work for the government. And try to somehow find your way to ecological restoration, although there's very few positions available. And even the parks, Canada, are not interested in doing large ecological restoration projects.
They're very against hiring anyone full-time ever, period.
So that wasn't the best route. The other route is actually going to school, getting a certificate, and becoming an ecological restoration practitioner, and then working for a private company or starting your own industry. Mm-hmm. That's the more on the ground. And the third is through consultation. So that's how these projects work. And often the large lucrative projects are industrial projects. So industry, mining, forestry comes in, they do a big project, they get the contract, but as part of their contract, they have to do ecological restoration after a number of years, right? So you think a lot of mining, right? Those mines are really destructive. They destroy the landscape around them. Part of the reason they're able to get those contracts is, okay, we're going to plant trees and try to restore the ecosystem on top of that. That's basically, in a nutshell, and I know I'm missing pieces of it, that's kind of how the industry works. And there's a lot of problems with that. One is that, the big one is that it's up to the kind of companies to restore the land, and the companies aren't necessarily interested in
doing any of that restoration work.
It's an expense for them, not an actual restorative practice. So that's a big one. The other side of it is I had a conversation with somebody from the federal parks department. He says, the parks are solely interested in conservation work, really. If we do an ecological restoration, it's a small piece of a larger project as well.
Right.
So there's not really a lot of money from the governments going towards these projects either. It's the idea is sort of it's someone else's mess to clean up. Yep. That's my sense of it.
Yep.
And that's not great either, because what you have is you have the industry and the government, both with the money to do these kinds of things, start to pass the buck to each other. And then it's
toss it back and forth. And then whoever ends up settled with it, like you as a contractor, maybe you're forced to work with as little as possible.
Exactly. And you might not even be like a great restoration company. You just might be just one trying to get the bottom line, right? Like, we can do this as cheaply as possible, right?
Exactly.
And that's not great for the land more often than not.
No.
So, in kind of thinking about what to do forward, the one hopeful example I sort of wanted to leave with, if that's okay.
Of course.
Yeah, is this really interesting model that I'm learning about for my job called tribal national parks.
Tribal national parks.
Yes, and this is where the government approaches a First Nation and gives them money and infrastructure and resources to essentially create a national park out of their land and out of government land.
Right.
Usually, often it's combined together.
Right.
And the tribe, the First Nation, runs the park itself. And what's key about this is that they're integrating not only like ecological restoration and preservation, but also cultural preservation and restoration. So when I was doing research, scientists and ecologists were saying, what's really great about the tribal parks is they actually perform better ecologically than the more conventional conservation model. And they get all these added cultural benefits as well, in that,
you're supporting a local community.
You're supporting a local community. And you're actually, engaged in reconciliation and following those 93 recommendations. That's actually one of the ways to do it. So that's something really hopeful that I think is trying to break the kind of dichotomy or dialectic that we have in conservation finance right now. And that gives me a lot of hope. Yeah.
Yeah, no, giving a bunch of people who care about the land a bunch of money to try and fix it.
To do it. And have it be part of,
an actual structure with
oversight
and part of those other parts are important too.
Yeah, exactly, and being a part of reconciliation. So it's for me, it's like ticking all the boxes about what ecological restoration should be. So, but so we went from, I know we covered a lot of ground. We went from climate despair to to UK forestry, which is so fascinating.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that was great. We wound up at conservation finance, but is there anything else we should touch on before we end?
What do we put on the list? So we've talked about some really positive ways in which the people are trying to wrestle with climate change and with what's happening and with what the appropriate paths are. I think the last thing I would ask is, for you personally, what are some things that you do just to make yourself feel more comfortable with all the things that you've learned and with the especially with the overt changes in the environment that are hard to deal with.
Yeah.
Especially when once you learn how to spot polluted rivers, then all the rivers are polluted. That's one of the things that's hard, I think, about this. Once you learn to spot pollution, it's just everywhere.
Yeah.
So how do you sort of overcome that? What's the technique to remain calm?
I think that's great. The key piece of advice I have for people is don't take on this stuff alone. It can be very isolating, right? Like these, eco-anxiety is the catch-all term right now. It's big, right? For people, it's self-evident, but the idea that yes, contemplating climate change causes anxiety. No crap, right?
Yeah, of course.
And the key is that anxiety can be very isolating for the people who experience it. I have a bit of generalized anxiety disorder. I know a lot of people with even more anxiety.
Of course.
Adding eco-anxiety in the mix isn't fun, and it can be incredibly isolating. So fortunately, there's been a lot more work on eco-anxiety in the last 5 years, and one of the big takeaways from it is working together in groups to process what's going on.
Right.
And not necessarily looking for solutions.
So as opposed to being, insulated on the internet,
just
Googling
reading all this
endlessly,
stuff all the time. It's like you see a nasty article or something upsetting, talk about it with somebody else, right? Get some help, right? Like learning how to process your feelings with other people.
Exactly.
And we've done at the University of Toronto, we've done these climate crisis cafes, and it's a bunch of people just coming together. We share our feelings on climate change. An hour later, people feel better. We haven't fixed anything, right?
Right.
But
you have.
But we have, but we've helped, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And I also think another thing that's key is...
And sorry, one of the reasons I say that is just because if you create these positive moments around a serious issue, then you create the opportunity for, if somebody puts up a hand and is like, I need help with this, and it's going to help the climate, as opposed to having those words cause fear and panic.
Yeah.
They get people excited. And, they're like, I want to come help, and that sounds like fun.
Exactly. It's fun, right? That's the key, is that this stuff doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. It's fun, And
you really enjoy it. Like,
I love it.
To give you physical examples, this kid builds gardens. He clears pathways.
Yeah, man, absolutely.
He cuts down vines,
Cut down vines. And,
everything. Yeah.
What's really great, if you live in a city, you're going to find like a Friends of the Ravine, your local ravine.
Exactly,
Or,
so many community groups.
Yeah, and they used to be all older people over 80. Now it's changed.